This channel grows one subscriber at a time. Be the next one. Getting closer. Two lines of descent run through the same people. One has stayed almost perfectly still for 4,000 years. The other has been quietly rewriting itself the entire time, generation after generation, without anyone noticing until the data was finally pulled apart and looked at properly. Both of those things are true at once. Only one of them agrees with the story everyone has been telling for the last century. The men's version of the record says, "Nothing changed here, not once, not ever." The women's version of the record says something else entirely, and until recently, nobody had bothered to ask it the question directly. For decades, the accepted picture was simple, and it was told with real confidence, in textbooks and documentaries and museum placards alike. Southern Iraq, the marshlands threaded between the Tigris and the Euphrates, is where the world's first cities rose out of the mudflats. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, where writing was pressed into wet clay for the first time, where the wheel first turned, where a civilization referred to itself, in its own tongue, as the people of the black-headed ones. The Sumerians. Their cities were abandoned, their language fell silent. Their script was scraped from memory and buried under later empires. And when that civilization eventually dissolved into the powers that rose after it, Akkadian, then Babylonian, then Persian, then Arab, most historians simply assumed its bloodline dissolved along with it. Absorbed into larger populations, diluted past recognition, gone, in any meaningful genetic sense, the way most ancient peoples eventually are. Except one population in that region never quite let go of the marshes. The Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq have lived in that same wetland for as long as anyone has kept records, building the same reed houses on floating islands, herding the same water buffalo along the same channels, speaking a dialect layered with older, half-buried words that predate the arrival of Arabic by millennia. Researchers studying them have called them, with real academic caution, the population with the strongest surviving genetic and cultural continuity to the ancient Sumerians. A lineage the marsh itself seemed to shelter, isolated by geography from the migrations, invasions, and empire building that swept across the rest of Mesopotamia for 4,000 years. It is a clean story, a satisfying one. The kind of continuity claim that lets a people say, with genuine justification behind it, "We are still here, we never left. The marsh kept us whole, while everything around us changed hands a dozen times over." Empires rose in the deserts to the north and west. Armies crossed the plain more times than anyone could count. Languages arrived, dominated, and eventually receded. And through all of it, according to the accepted version of events, the marsh itself acted as a kind of biological seal. Too wet, too remote, too difficult to conquer or resettle, protecting the population inside it from the demographic churn that reshaped everyone else in the region. For a long time, nobody thought to ask otherwise. Archaeologists had pottery, linguists had loanwords. Anthropologists had reed boat construction techniques passed down almost unchanged from images carved into 4,000-year-old cylinder seals. Every discipline that touched the Marsh Arabs kept arriving at the same reassuring conclusion, and each new study seemed to confirm the last, until the continuity claim carried the weight of near consensus behind it. Here is where it gets complicated. That continuity claim was built almost entirely on one type of evidence, and it was never fully tested against the most obvious question a geneticist could ask of an isolated population. Do the mothers agree with the fathers? In 2011, a team of researchers finally ran that test directly. They sampled DNA from 143 Marsh Arabs and compared it against a broader set of Iraqi control populations, examining two separate genetic archives that every human body carries at once, inherited along two completely different paths. The first is the Y-chromosome, passed down from father to son and almost nowhere else, largely unchanged in its broad structure across dozens of generations. Something like a surname written not on paper but directly into the body itself, inherited along a single unbroken paternal thread stretching back further than any written record. The second archive is mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mother to child and only from mother to child, an entirely separate record carried along the maternal line the same way a house might pass from a woman to her daughter, regardless of who the father happens to be, where he came from, or what name he carries. In a population this geographically isolated, sealed off for millennia by reed and water, both archives should, in theory, tell roughly the same story. They did not. The Y-chromosome data lined up almost perfectly with the consensus everyone already believed. One specific paternal lineage showed a clear, measurable local expansion, timed almost exactly to the Sumerian city-state period, stable, internally consistent, exactly what 4,000 years of undisturbed continuity should look like on paper. Clean, expected. But the mitochondrial data, the maternal line, told a noticeably different story. It carried faint but genuine traces of ancestry from further afield, signals connected to Southwest Asia, and weaker but still measurable signals connected to Africa, traces that showed up far more visibly on the mother's side of the record than on the father's. The father's line looked frozen in place, exactly where it had always been. The mother's line looked like it had traveled. It had absorbed something. It had kept a record the father's line never had to keep. A haplogroup, in either lineage, functions like a family crest passed down without ever being redrawn. A genetic marker that lets researchers trace which broad branch of the human family a particular line of ancestors belonged to, going back tens of thousands of years if the marker is old enough. When two haplogroups from the same population point toward two different origins on two different timelines, that isn't noise. That's a contradiction sitting inside a single bloodline. The researchers behind the study were careful to frame their findings as probability rather than certainty. The sample size is meaningful but not enormous. An ancient population history rarely resolves into one single clean answer, no matter how good the underlying data set is. But the direction of the divergence was consistent across the sample, appearing again and again in the data rather than as a single outlying result. And it demanded some kind of explanation. Something had kept the paternal line locked almost perfectly in place for millennia, while the maternal line kept quietly absorbing new ancestry, decade after decade, without ever disturbing the surface story. The question was what, exactly, had done that? The first theory is the most straightforward, and it draws on a well-documented pattern found across many ancient farming and pastoral societies worldwide, not just in Mesopotamia. It is called patrilocality, the custom of men remaining in their home community for life, generation after generation, while women move to join their husband's family, sometimes from a neighboring village, sometimes from much further away than anyone in that village would ever travel themselves. Under a system like that, the male genetic line stays essentially fixed in place, while the female line is constantly quietly refreshed by newcomers arriving through marriage, one household at a time, one generation at a time. If the Marsh Arabs practiced a long tradition of patrilocal marriage, and there is reason to think they did, that alone could explain a great deal of why the Y-chromosome record looks so remarkably stable, while the mitochondrial record looks so much more varied underneath it. It is a solid explanation, and it carries real anthropological weight. But it does not fully explain the specific direction of that maternal variation, why the signal points outward toward Southwest Asia and Africa specifically, rather than simply toward the next settlement over. Patrilocality explains movement. It does not explain distance. This is the part the records don't fully explain on their own. The second theory looks outward toward geography and commerce rather than marriage custom. Southern Mesopotamia sat at the head of the Persian Gulf, a natural funnel point for maritime trade routes that, even in the Bronze Age, reached toward the East African coast in one direction and the Indian subcontinent in the other. The same 2011 study noted that water buffalo herding and rice cultivation, both still central to Marsh Arab life today, most likely arrived in the region from the Indian subcontinent, though the genetic evidence suggests that particular migration only marginally affected the wider regional gene pool. Trade brought goods, animals, ideas, and occasionally people, moving through a network far larger than the marsh itself. It is a theory with genuine historical backing, but trade alone doesn't easily explain why the signal shows up almost exclusively on the maternal side of the ledger. Cargo does not have a sex. Ancestry, in this specific case, clearly does. There is a version of this second theory that researchers find easier to defend, and it doesn't require anyone to have been taken anywhere against their will. Long-distance trade networks in the ancient world were rarely one-way streets. Merchants settled. Sailors married into port communities. Entire households sometimes relocated permanently to follow a trade relationship that had proven profitable across several generations. Any of these ordinary voluntary movements could, over enough centuries, leave exactly the kind of faint maternal signal researchers are seeing now. The honest answer is that the genetic data alone cannot distinguish a merchant's daughter who married into the marsh from a woman who arrived by an entirely different, far less voluntary route. Both leave the same kind of trace. Only the historical record, if it survives at all, can tell the two apart. The third theory is the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in a peer-reviewed paper, and the genetic literature itself stops well short of stating it directly, leaving the implication to sit quietly between the lines. Historical and textual records from the ancient Near East, temple accounts, palace inventories, Administrative tablets recovered from sites across Mesopotamia do document the movement of foreign women into households through routes that had nothing to do with trade agreements or marriage alliances. Captured labor, tribute payments, and coerced domestic service, all separately attested in the surviving cuneiform record of the period, independent of any genetic study. The genetic data doesn't confirm this explanation, and it would be dishonest to claim that it does. It only fails to rule it out. No published study has yet drawn a direct line between a specific administrative tablet and a specific mitochondrial signature recovered from a living population today. But the broader pattern the DNA shows, outside ancestry entering a population almost exclusively through women, sustained over an extraordinarily long span of time, is consistent with more than one kind of movement across that boundary, and historians of the region are the first to point out that not all of those movements were voluntary. That possibility sits underneath the genetic data, unresolved and uncomfortable, separated from the comfortable version of the story not by years, by centuries. There is a second image worth holding alongside the first. Imagine standing in a courtyard of reeds and packed mud brick on the edge of the marsh, somewhere south of at the hour when the daytime heat finally breaks, and the evening air turns thick with wood smoke and wet reed and river silt. A woman kneels at a grindstone, working barley into flour for the evening meal, her hands moving in a rhythm she learned from her mother, who learned it in turn from hers, a chain of hands stretching back further than anyone in the household could name. Somewhere nearby, carried faintly on the evening air, a fragment of another language drifts past. Not the tongue of the city, not the tongue of her husband's household, something else entirely, spoken low, half-remembered, half-suppressed. She does not think of herself as evidence of anything. She has no reason to. She will never know that 4,000 years later, a fragment of her own body, carried forward daughter to daughter to daughter across 130 generations, will end up as the only surviving record of wherever that other language, and whatever brought it here, actually came from. No tablet will record her name, no inscription will mark her house. The only archive that survives her is written in a molecule too small to see, passed hand to hand, body to body, down a line that never once thought of itself as evidence. And here the story stops being simple. Because the assumption underneath the entire continuity claim, that the Marsh Arabs represent an unbroken, sealed Sumerian bloodline, untouched by the churn of empires rising and falling around them, turns out to be only half right, and it is the more visible, more heavily studied half. The father's line really does look remarkably stable across 4,000 years. Researchers were not wrong about that part. But the mother's line was never sealed at all. It was open the entire time, quietly absorbing new ancestry century after century, generation after generation, while the paternal record stayed still enough to make the whole population look frozen solid from the outside looking in. The fathers held the line, literally. The mothers kept moving, kept absorbing, kept adapting to whoever and whatever the marsh let in. Adapted. The population most often held up as living proof of Sumerian purity turns out, on closer genetic inspection, to be living proof of something closer to the opposite. That even the most isolated-looking lineage in Mesopotamian history was never actually closed to the outside world. It was simply being read from the wrong half of the record the entire time. One researcher working in this field of ancient Iraqi population genetics put it more plainly in conversation than any published paper ever quite manages to. You cannot claim a people never changed if you only ever examine the line that was built, by custom and by circumstance, to hide the change. Not confirmed, not disproven either. That is where the science currently has to stop, and where the honest version of this story has to stop with it. The fathers kept the myth intact, generation after generation. The mothers kept the receipts. It is worth sitting with what that actually means for a moment. 130 generations of women, one after another, each one passing an unbroken thread of mitochondrial DNA to the next. Through famine years and flood years, through empires that rose in Babylon and fell to Persia, and fell again to Rome's eastern rivals, through the arrival of Islam and the slow retreat of Aramaic, and the long, quiet persistence of the marsh itself. Empires changed hands overhead, language changed on the surface, religion changed entirely, and underneath all of it, that single maternal thread kept moving forward, carrying its extra passengers, never once matching the father's version of events. This pattern is not unique to the marshes of southern Iraq, and that is precisely what makes it unsettling rather than merely local. Across dozens of population genetic studies conducted worldwide, the same asymmetry keeps resurfacing. Paternal lines that look ancient, undisturbed, and internally consistent, sitting directly alongside maternal lines that carry a far messier, far more mobile history underneath them. Hidden in plain sight for as long as nobody thought to compare the two. Nearly every claim of an unchanged people, in nearly every corner of the world, has historically been built on whichever half of the genome happened to get studied first and most thoroughly. And that half has, for most of the history of the field, been the father's. Whose history gets remembered as pure and whose gets remembered as mixed, has often depended on nothing more dramatic than which archive researchers thought to open first. The Y-chromosome record of the Marsh Arabs reads like an inscription carved deep into stone. Legible, consistent, built to last, telling exactly the story everyone already expected it to tell before a single sample was ever taken. The mitochondrial record reads like something else entirely, a palimpsest. The same kind of scraped and rewritten clay tablet archaeologists keep pulling out of the ruins of Ur itself. One story scraped away and quietly written over by another, and then another, across 4,000 years, never fully erased, always faintly legible underneath if anyone bothers to look closely enough. Scholars have spent a century learning to read the tablets that survive on clay. Almost no one thought to read the tablet that survives inside a living body, until the technology finally caught up to the question. After 4,000 years of silence, it was the women's DNA that finally broke through that surface, and what it said was never meant to stay this simple.